Um, because I don't have a film actually of myself running one of these finance workshops, and because we haven't had a window of opportunity to have a real workshop, what I've chosen to do is to set up an imaginary workshop in which I'll try and give you some idea of how this might run. The dynamics, of course, are going to be a little bit different than you might normally expect, but I can work with that if you guys can. What I've attempted to do is, over here you'll see we've got a table, and on the table we've got we've got 4 bottles, and they're meant to represent 4 teams, because the way I envisage this working is that people will work in teams, and I'll explain a little bit more why that's important in due course, and the teams have got names just to help clarify who's who and what's what. So I'm going to attempt to do the introductory 10 or 15 minutes and explain a little bit about what we're doing here and what's important and that kind of stuff, just to give you a bit of an idea of what it would look like. So really, without further ado, I'm going to pretend that we've started, and I'm going to say good morning and all that sort of stuff, so we'll make a start. Morning everyone, nice to see you. It's always nice to see people filled with such enthusiasm and energy coming along to a Finance for Non-Finance Managers course. What I'd like to do is, before we kind of get into the bones of what we're going to talk about and really get you involved, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an introduction about what we're going to cover, discuss a little bit of background about why we're here, my perspective, and then what we'll do is I'll move you through during the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes, and I'll explain to you what we're going to cover, roughly when we're going to cover it, and we'll cover off details like breaks and style and all that kind of thing. Is that okay for everybody? People happy with that? Okay. I'm not expecting to get many answers, but you never know. The world works in weird and wonderful ways. I'd like to start by just drawing your attention to my first flip chart. And you'll see that I've entitled this, I want to do finance for non-finance managers. In Spain, they have a saying that I hear frequently used, and the saying goes something like, somos tontos pero no somos locos. And what that basically means is, I'm crazy but I'm not that crazy. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes just exploring with you why you're not crazy wanting to do this course. Then I'd like to take about 5 minutes and just talk about more or less what we're going to cover. The more or less is important because for this to work, this can sometimes be perceived as a dry subject. For it to work, it has to be very interactive. And in fact, that leads me nicely to the third point. I'd like to just give you some flavour of how you're going to do that. And you notice I've said how you're going to do that. Because after this introduction, I hope that my input will be very little other than what the technical people would call facilitation. In other words, I want this to be a voyage of discovery, genuinely, for you. I have things to tell you, but actually I've got very few things to tell you. I've got some information to impart, but for the most part, what I want to do, my job today, is to help you to understand, help you to realise, genuinely, that there's very little about this subject that you don't already know. And that's a good place to start. Why are you not crazy? Let me ask you a couple of questions, if I may. If I was to say to you, ask you to define capital, what is capital? What is it? What would your answer be? Bearing in mind that we're living in a capitalist world, our whole economic system, our life, the very way in which we operate, the day-to-day life that we live is all underpinned by something called capitalism. So what is capital? And actually capital, the sense of capital and what it means and where it fits in the world of finance is quite an important concept that people often are confused about. By the end of today, I hope that you'll have a much better understanding of what that is and why it's important. And even that might even help you more generally in the world, of the capitalist world. Let me ask you another question. There's a series of numbers. This is a kind of a finance man's trick. A whole series of numbers for 2 companies, one of which incidentally is Mattel. I'd like you to just give me a sense of which company do you think is doing better and why? Finance people have a habit of throwing these enormous columns of numbers at people and saying, well, now what does that mean to you? And for some of you that already might mean something. Because for some of you, you are going to have abilities and skills that other people don't have in the room. That's okay. That's really fine. But for those of you who don't have those abilities and skills, I'd say to you, listen to the people who do. And for those of you who maybe know more about this, I'd say to you, listen to the people who don't. Because often, the questions from the people who don't have as much knowledge are just as valuable, more valuable, than the questions you might ask. So stay open to the fact that there is no such thing as a stupid question. So, I mean, I'm not expecting you to give me an answer at this stage in the game, but I would, by the end of the day, expect you to have some sense of some of the key elements of what's in there, why they're important, and what they mean. So there's two concepts that are kind of financially orientated. And let me ask you another question. Supposing you wanted to buy a new car. Maybe some of you have company cars, but you decide to buy an extra car for your wife or for one of your children. What would you do? How would you go about doing it? What kinds of questions would you be asking? How would you be looking for money? How would you be planning that? What kinds of options would you be looking at? You'd be doing all of that. You'd be looking at different kinds of financing. You'd be thinking about whether you're paying more or less money. You'd be thinking about, do I have the money? When might I have it? Would you be thinking about, overall, what's this going to cost me? Now, all of those are financial concepts and actually quite important ones. And they're things that you do every day in your everyday life. So in fact, you know more than you think you know. What tends to make this a little bit scary for people, a little bit difficult for people, is that there is jargon associated with it, which puts people off. And it tends to seem to be very complex. It's not that complex. You're making complex, sophisticated decisions every day in your everyday life. And you can equally bring some of that knowledge, some of that skill into work, to work with people in finance particularly, but to work around the concepts that are important in finance. So by the end of today, I want to show you, I hope to be able to show you, what you already know and how that can be used to bring to your work, to bring to the workplace at Mattel, in order to make the kinds of impact that you need to make. Because there's another thing that's worth saying. I said that when I asked what's capital, I said, well, you ought to understand it because we're living in a capitalist system.